Let's open up the Vintage Collection 3.75-inch figure of Greef Karga from The Mandalorian.
Varykino. If it's Star Wars, we collect it.
Hello there, thanks for visiting Varykino. Here in New Zealand, today it is January 14th, which is Carl Weathers' birthday. Carl portrayed the character of Greef Karga in the Mandalorian series and also directed a few episodes of the show as well. Sadly, Carl Weathers passed away last year, so we wanted to spend some time on his birthday today to celebrate his Star Wars legacy by unboxing a Greef Karga figure. We had the absolute pleasure of seeing Carl Weathers in person at Star Wars Celebration in London back in 2023, and it was clear to see just how much he loved being a part of Star Wars and meeting the fans. We have a few Greef Karga figures in our collection as we love the character and his story arc, but they are all still in their packaging. To celebrate Carl Weathers on his birthday today, I picked out the Vintage Collection 3.75-inch figure of Greef Karga from Season 2 to open up and add to our Star Wars action figure display. So thank you so much for hanging out with me today. Coming up really soon, I'll take a closer look at the figure out of the packaging so we can go over all of the details, but first let's take one last look at the backing card. The packaging for the Vintage Collection line is heavily inspired by the original Kenner vintage Star Wars action figures from the 1970s and 80s. They both have the Star Wars logo across the top and that iconic chrome racetrack design surrounding the character art. We have the Mandalorian series logo here at the top in red as usual, and for this figure of Greef Karga we have a mustard or perhaps a gold accent color here for the nameplate with the black font that reads Greef Karga, and that same accent color is used behind the figure there as well. I think it's interesting that this version of Greef Karga is Season 2, where he has the title of Magistrate, but he is simply named as Greef Karga for this figure, whereas the Black Series 6-inch figure version of this particular outfit, it is titled as Magistrate Greef Karga. Interesting that the Black Series has this title, whereas the Vintage Collection figure does not. I do really like the card art here of Greef Karga. It's a nice clear image. We've got a bit of Navarro here in the background. We can see his costume details really well, and like the fact that his arm is not cut off by the bubble here. We can see his arm holding his blaster accessory nice and clear there. Quite a nice piece of artwork there celebrating the character. And of course we can see the figure quite clearly. He has a really interesting plastic robe here. I'm really keen to see this one out of the packaging so I can really see the robe, sort of see how it fits and lays on the character. And we also have a blaster pistol accessory which matches nicely to the character art. I really like to see both of those matching up, especially for collectors that like to keep their figures carded. It really does look nice when they match up. Moving on to the back. Now you can see this is a slightly older Vintage Collection figure, VC185, when Hasbro was still doing these slightly older backing card style here, a bit more inspired by the original Kenner backing cards, where we have the preview images of other figures released around the same time, which you can see here. And we also have the Star Wars logo and the double chrome racetrack design. We have the Vintage Collection logo here on the back, and the rest of it is the barcode and copyright details there. So not too much interesting on the back. I do really like the front, but of course I think it's definitely time to get this one out of the packaging so I can check out the details and add them to my display. So now I have the Greef Karga figure as well as his blaster pistol accessory out of the packaging so we can take a closer look. So of course I really enjoy the modern Vintage Collection era in terms of the sculpting and paint details, but I have to say for this figure the facial likeness is really spot on. I can see the character, I can hear his voice lines. It's just really nice, and especially since Carl Weathers has sadly passed away, I think it's important to have a figure of his character that just really looks like him. These figures are our touchstone to the characters and the actors that portrayed them, especially the ones that are no longer with us. And of course sadly we're no longer going to see any more adventures of Greef Karga, so I'm really happy that Hasbro has him in the Vintage Collection line. He has quite a few outfits. I'm hoping we get all of them eventually, but of course when he is Magistrate in Season 2, I really like the robes, and we really get to sort of explore his character arc a little bit more in Season 2. So I think this one is a really good choice. So let's take a closer look at the painting and the sculpting details of this figure. Starting, as I usually do, with the face, as I was talking about, it just really captures Carl Weathers' likeness here. I like sort of hearing the voice lines in my head when I'm looking at a figure. It just really captures his likeness well. So I am really especially happy with the digital printing for his beard. Beards are really tricky. If a character in the past had a beard, it was painted rather thickly, almost like head hair, but of course not every character has a thick beard, and I think the fine digital printing here, capturing that sort of grey stubble beard, is just really nice. It's almost so fine that my eyes have a trouble picking up on those fine digital printing dots. I can just make it out, and I just really like it. It was almost kind of a slight sort of mottled appearance, because of course grey hair is not uniform in color. I like the sort of the different shading here, a little bit thicker around sort of the mustache and a chin area. It's really nice. Now, of course, his hair is short. We have a little bit of texture here, but it is sculpted as a piece with the head, which means that we do have a paint line. And if you look closely, we do have a little bit of misalignment with the black paint used for his hair and his forehead line. There is just a little bit that extends beyond, kind of gives him a little bit more of a widow's peak than he has actually. You can see the sculpting and the paint just doesn't quite line up there. In terms of the rest of it, it looks fine. It's just that unfortunate little patch there right at the front on my particular figure. I know that's not going to be the case on everyone's figure. I do try and look at my figures really close up before I buy them, but sometimes you just have to grab the figure that's available at your local store. So he does have a lot of intricate details for his magistrate costume. It's going to be just a lot of fun going through all of the costume details. So something else that I wanted to have a look at was how well all of the paint lines up with the sculpting details. Of course, we've got this plastic robe that is sort of attached on him. We've got a little bit of a plastic strap here across to sort of keep it from falling off, which is nice. And of course, we've kind of got a little bit of a sort of like a badges with a bit of a chain across. So it's a little bit thick here because of course they can't sort of do a really tiny chain. So we've got this sort of plastic section across here, kind of like the way that they do on sort of Count Dooku figures. That's what that really reminds me of, sort of like clasps and a chain to sort of hold his sort of cape across his chest here. So the gold printing is not all the way across, and I've got to sort of look at some of the high-res costume details to see if that is supposed to be all the way across. I think because it has kind of like almost a Morse code appearance, I think this is actually trying to sort of match up to how it appears on the costume. We've sort of got a really sort of short dot, two long dashes, another short dot. So I think that probably makes sense that is matching up to the costume details. It's very fine. And we've also got those sort of gold clasps. So when I look at them, the paint is just a little bit misaligned with the sculpting detail for the clasps. You can see the paint is a little bit more to the right compared to that raised detail of the clasp there. And on this one, it's also just a little bit of a spill over to the right. Really, really tiny. I'm looking up close, but of course, I do like all of the details to be painted as best as I can. Not that I am particularly good with hand painting myself, but of course, you know, we want our figures to look as cool as possible. We've got this sort of detail trim running down the front of his cloak here, but it's more of like a gloss black against more of the matte finish of the sort of fabric section of the robes here. Of course, it's plastic here. And we've got the inner, which is also painted a contrasting sort of mustard yellow color, which I quite like. It's not a metallic gold, but it might be sort of trying to be a little bit more of a gold tone, just not fully metallic there. We do have a metallic gold painted detail here on his belt buckle, but the clasp above it is not painted, but we do have that sort of sculpting detail there. Interesting to see that we're going to check out some really interesting articulation, because of course we've got this big cloak over the top. It looks like we've maybe got articulation in a couple of different places through his torso. Really interesting there. Moving around to the back, we've got some accent painting around on sort of the shoulder section of his robe here. There's a very fine raised line here, and of course we've got sort of these quilted padded sections over the shoulder, nice sculpted detail there. We've got a dark painted line going across the top there. this one here is just a little bit off center. This painted line here lines up really well with the hard edge of that painted detail. But this one here just kind of goes a little bit off, and it's actually on more towards the left. It's not on this kind of diamond shaped section here. It's a little bit over to the left, so not quite lining up with the sculpting detail. Of course, I'm looking very, very close. If I put it away like this, my eyes can't see the detail there. So I'm, again, looking very, very close up. We can see that we've got some nice draping here for that cloak there in the back. Interesting sort of cutout section here. It's kind of straight edged along on this edge, and then here it kind of billows out a little bit, so we can kind of see it next to his hand, which is kind of interesting. On this side it's just sort of a little bit more straighter, and we've kind of got this section that's kind of billowing out. Now you can see here, unfortunately on my particular figure, the black paint from this section has kind of, I don't know if that's more of an overspray. It's kind of gone a little bit over onto this side, so it's not a clean sort of yellow lining section hard up against the edge like we get up here. We've got a little bit of that black coming into the back. A little bit of a shame, because it does show when I've posed my figure from the front there, I can kind of see it. Hopefully it's going to look a little bit more like a shadow when I put my figure on display, but a little bit of a shame. Of course, we want our paint jobs to be good on our figures. In terms of any kind of things that are jumping out at me as well, it looks like I've got perhaps a little bit of a defect in the plastic here on the front. Unfortunately, that just looks a little bit like a cut in the plastic. I guess, of course, I'm not sure if this is like a defect with the sculpt. It does feel like something's cut into it, so I'm hoping it's just perhaps, you know, a little bit of an unfortunate incident with my particular figure. Again, sometimes you just got to grab the figures that you can find, but it's a little unfortunate because it's right on the front of my character. But of course, at least it's on the black, so that dark color does hide that defect a little bit better there. So I was curious to see if this robe could actually come off. Sometimes I like to take the sort of outer robes off so I can see the articulation and the costume details underneath, but this little strap here across the front is part of the figure. I can't undo it. And so I just want to do a quick little experiment just to see if this will lift off. I don't know that I can get it off without being a little bit more rough than perhaps you can kind of hear it creaking. I believe it's pretty tight around his chin, so it's not just going to completely lift off. Of course, with these figures, you can sort of see by the articulation, I can pop the head off this figure if I want to sort of take this off, but we don't really see him without his robes, and I prefer the way that the figure looks with them on. So personally, for me, I'm not going to take it off. And I also I always get anxious removing the heads off figures. It can be quite a bit of a tough job to pull them off, and also I just don't want to strain this particular very thin plastic section there. So I'm just going to keep them on for now, but we'll take a quick look at the figure underneath. So it looks like, just sort of checking out the costume details, he's wearing a sort of a high-necked red tunic or shirt that comes down past his belt, with a black vest that comes all the way down, sort of crossing here just above his belt there. So we've got that little clasp holding his vest. We've got a little bit of a pocket here sculpted into the side. We've got a brown leather belt with a gold buckle detail there. The gold on mine is a little bit faint. I kind of wished it was a little bit of a thicker gold application there. And of course, we've got brown pants. We do have a brown holster here on the back, but as you can see, we do have sort of like a sculpted sort of holster strap on his thigh, but it's not actually attached to the holster itself. The holster is actually sort of hanging down as part of the back section of the lower half of his tunic. So hopefully that is not going to restrict our posability. Sometimes when you get those holsters that are sculpted separately and they kind of hover around and you can move them around, sometimes that can help us with posability. Other times it sort of just gets in the way. So that's interesting. So of course the lower half of his tunic is that sort of a rubbery, more flexible plastic. And the rest of his costume is pretty much just sort of brown pants. We can see the articulation at the knees there. And we've got sort of a dark grey boots there. No painting details, but we've got some really nice straps sculpted in there on his boots there. Really nice. So not too much in the way of painting. He's got gloves. Now it looks like It's hard to tell. There's a little subtle color difference between sort of the gauntlet section of his glove and his actual sort of hand section there. You can sort of see, because I believe these sleeves would be cast in this sort of reddish plastic. Then this gauntlet section is painted, and then this is cast in a brown plastic. So sometimes when you get the plastic and paint combination, you get a very subtle color difference because it's hard to match. Or sometimes it's just the glossiness of paint that catches your eye and makes it look different there. So pretty good match, but to my eye under this lighting, they do look slightly different in color there. But yeah, so those are some painted details. They look fine in terms of the actual paint. You can see there from the top looking down, very nicely painted around the cups there, looking pretty good. So overall, I'm pretty happy with the paint job on this figure. My main sort of quibble is the sort of clasps being just a tiny bit misaligned and that tiny little bit of extra black paint there at the hairline. Very, very small. If I stand them back on my action figure display shelf, I'm sure I'm really not going to notice those. Of course, we do have that little bit of black paint there where it probably shouldn't be on the lining there as well, and that small little unfortunate plastic defect. But again, minor notes that are specific to my figure. I really hope other fans do not have those same issues there. I do like the way that when I sort of hold the tunic close to the body, you can see the way it's kind of sculpted to sort of hug in close to the sleeves with the way that it sort of sits here with the sort of folding in. So of course, even though it's going to swing around and stuff like that, it does sit quite nice to the body. It does look like robes. Sometimes with plastic, it kind of hovers around the body because it's rigid and it doesn't have the weight and drape of a fabric. I know it must be really interesting. I'd love to see sort of draft versions of figures, the prototypes, but do they make fabric versions of this, or do they just go straight and go, let's just make it plastic? I'm always curious. When it comes to having painted details, they generally have to do it in plastic. I guess it's very complicated for them to do very small painted details on fabric. We generally don't see that. So because he's got all of this sort of small clasp details, they probably opted to go with a plastic sculpted one, even though I do see some older era Dooku figures that did actually had a little bit of sort of like a gold cord over a fabric cloak, but his is much smaller and sort of hangs towards the back of the body. Because this one hangs down the front, I can see why they did it in plastic there, and I think it looks pretty good. Hasbro's gotten very good with the sort of the drape and sculpting to make their plastic look like fabric, so I really like that. And of course, it doesn't actually go all the way down to the floor, so it's not sort of propping him up. Sometimes those robes, they kind of hold the figure up off the ground, but he is standing on his feet. And as you can see, it's not actually really affecting him too much in terms of his center of gravity. He stands up nice and straight. I'm not having to bend him too far forward or back to get a balance, even though he does have a lot of plastic hanging down the back compared to the amount of plastic hanging down the front. I really like how stable he is, which is very good. Okay, so just a few other sort of notes catching my eye. We've got a little bit of a texture here for his tunic around the front here. You can see a little bit on his sleeve, but to be honest, it's actually kind of really subtle. It's almost, you can just kind of see the lines there. I didn't even really notice it first time, and because this lower half of the red tunic is quite smooth. It doesn't have any of that kind of texture that we see up here on this painted section. Again, this would be a painted red, and this is a plastic red. You can kind of see the fact that it's plastic along the top of the belt. The brown doesn't completely cover that red there, but that is a pretty good color match. It's not grabbing my attention, so that's good to see. Okay, so because the cape is really hovering around his body, I don't think it's going to get too much in the way of articulation, but let's go through and test it out. So nice and easy movement on his head. I can turn him all the way around if I need to, so good articulation there. He can actually tip his head quite a fair way back. Some modern figures really struggle to sort of tip their head back or forwards much. A lot of movement there. Very nice side to side. Okay, let's test out his arms. So you can see that his plastic coat does come down over the shoulders a little bit here, but because it's not really attached, we should be able to move his arms up, but that might raise his cape up a little bit there and kind of give us just a little bit more of a sort of a hunched effect. You can see we've kind of raised it up there at the back. But of course, if we want to, we can get his arms all the way up there. Might be a different story if we want to rotate his arms up. Can't go straight up with his rotation. He's kind of coming out here to the side because this plastic is not budging. I can't really get his arm closer to his shoulder there, sort of rotating that up. But that is a bit of an extreme angle. Personally, I don't really have too much use for that angle with my figures. Let's test out his elbows here. A bit stiff on that side, but of course he's fresh out of the plastic. There we go. Looks pretty good. That wasn't too hard. Pretty good posing there with his arms, because of course we don't really have any bulky armor. He doesn't really have too much on his forearms either as well. So nice turning there. Just looking at the tight little, yep, we can go side to side. That's actually pretty reasonable. Sometimes with the sculpting of these sort of flared gloves or sort of gauntlet style gloves, sometimes it can get in the way. I was just looking at it. There is quite a cut-in around his wrist there, which does sort of draw my eye a little bit. And it does kind of look a little bit disjointed, like these are two separate things. But I can get pretty good articulation with his hands there. So I'm assuming that's a little bit of a trade-off there. And we've probably got the same on the other side. Yes, we do have side-to-side movement with his hands. Quite a lot of side-to-side movement, really. I can really get some good wrist movement there. And just looking at his fingers, he actually has extended trigger fingers on both hands, which is quite unusual. He only has the one blaster pistol accessory. So I guess you've got the option of putting his accessory in either hand, whichever way you choose. Oftentimes, if they have one accessory, they will have it in their dominant hand, which is often the right hand, as having an extended trigger finger to fit in the trigger guard. And then the other hand is more of just a classic kind of generic accessory grip there. So that's kind of interesting. We'll test that out shortly. Now it looks like, yes, he does have that mid-torso articulation along the line here. You can see it does cut through his vest shape here a little bit. Kind of gives the top of his tunic and vest a little bit of sort of like a clone trooper armor plate shape, almost sort of painted to look like the rest of his clothes. It does give it a bit of sort of a over-the-top appearance. He can move quite a fair bit forward. It's a little bit hard to kind of show the shape that it's kind of creating here in the back. You can see we've kind of got a little bit of a bulge here because this has to be rounded so that it's not sort of creating a hard edge in the articulation. You can see there, that's a lot of movement for a mid-torso articulation there, which is quite nice. And oh, that's very easy to move side to side. Sometimes they can be quite clicky, or you feel like you might break something when you swivel them side to side. That's very easy to move, and he is not snapping back. Of course, it's completely breaking up the patterning on the front of his tunic there. As soon as you move it, you're misaligning that V-neck shape there. So, but if you want to get into a fun pose, you can kind of hide that a little bit with some of his front robes to kind of hide the fact that that's twisted all the way around. Now, it looks like we've got a attachment line here just above the belt, because we know this is hard plastic and this is flexible plastic. But I just want to see if he does not swivel at that point. I was curious, because in the modern era, we often get sort of the turning side to side movement through here and not with the belt. And even though it actually looks like it might, if I grasp him really tightly, he does not move at the waist there. So that's really interesting. Moving on to the lower half of the body. So of course, the lower section of his shirt / tunic is made out of that more flexible rubbery plastic. We can see that it's actually joined up on this side. So it sort of starts here, wraps around this side with a small split at the hip and continues around there. So you don't have to worry about sort of creating a split up in the plastic because it's not actually joined, but I am going to be careful about this one. You can see it's already under a little bit of tension on his hip there. It is splayed open. We do have that circular sort of top to it, but it doesn't always stop a split from creating and traveling up further. So I am going to be a little bit careful on this one. This hip, we do have that sort of holster, which is is sculpted on the bottom of it, but the actual edge doesn't look thicker than the one next to it. Maybe just a tiny bit thicker, but it does flex quite well. So I'm hoping that won't sort of get in the way. And of course, it's not actually attached to this strap that is sculpted on the thigh there. We do have those swivel connections there in the mid thigh. You can see it just there. So I can rotate his legs side to side. We've got one on the other side here as well. But let's test out how well he can move his legs. So of course this is a slightly older figure and he has an older style of attachment. Hasbro's been improving on a lot of their articulation points across their Star Wars figure line. This one has an older style. It is not that new barbell style, which is really nice in terms of flexibility. So of course Greef Karga is not an acrobatic character, but I do want to test out his articulation in terms of his legs. But I'm having a bit of trouble getting his legs sort of aligned up in a way so I can test out the articulation. Everything's a little bit tight and I'm just not getting a lot of movement there. Okay, so very carefully, that is about as high as I can get that leg to go. I'm getting a lot of resistance here at this particular section that is stopping the leg from moving up that high there. So he's not going to be doing a lot of high kicks here. And it's just a very stiff attachment point. And I'm finding the figure wants to sort of come apart at this attachment point when I'm sort of trying to put pressure on this top hip attachment. It's flexing at that swivel joint in the mid thigh, so I'm being very careful with it. So in terms of this side, just going to have a little bit of a tiny play. This is really flexing open. I feel like this is going to move and potentially pop off before I actually get his actual leg to move at the thigh, at the actual hip part. That thigh attachment point feels not loose, but it's moving a much more, and I don't know that I can get that hip to really move out much. That's kind of bothering me. This feels like this is going to move or potentially break rather than up here. It's very tight at his hip. I'm not getting movement at all. And of course, it is an older figure. He's been in his packet for a long time, but I should be able to sort of move and pose him a little bit better than that. And I've probably gone and twisted his legs around a little bit. I'm going to be tweaking his pose because I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to get him to stand up quite the same way. His legs are very stiff. It's not my favorite, I gotta say, in terms of the joints, particularly around underneath this tunic part there. But we'll test out his knees. Okay, that is a very good angle there. That's quite a high angle. Normally we just kind of get straight across. He's going up higher than that. There is a bit of sort of a cutout you can see at the back of the knee, so we don't have the pants completely hitting on the lower half. We've got that sort of exposed sort of hinge there, so we can close completely up. So we do get a little bit of sort of a cutout in the back. Not my favorite sculpting, but this is again an older figure. I think they've gotten a little bit better. When it comes to the trade-offs between sculpting and articulation, for me personally, I do prefer sculpting over articulation because I'm not too adventurous with my poses. I generally have my figures just standing on the shelf. I do some cool poses for photography, but when it comes to putting them on my shelf, I don't want them tipping over, so they're a little bit more boring. But yeah, good knee articulation. I'm really happy with that. Perhaps less happy with the sculpting. It's just got this sort of very obvious gap between the thigh and the lower half here. It looks pretty good from the front though. Of course, we've got with the pants coming down over the knee to really sort of fit in that with that curve of the sculpting, fitting in with sort of the wrinkles that you get when you tuck pants into boots. I think that's always useful for Star Wars figures. And well, let's test out the ankle articulation. He can actually roll to the side a little bit, which is nice. He actually moves quite easily side to side. I don't find that in a lot of my figures, but he's not going to tip back, to be honest. I can tip forward and back. He is completely hitting here, so he's not going to be pointing his toe really. It's completely hitting, and I feel like I'm just pulling on the plastic rather than doing any movements there. So he can tip his toes forward, not back. So definitely going to have to play around with his legs there a little bit, because I feel like The articulation around the hips is not the greatest on this figure, but he's wearing sort of fancy robes. He does have a blaster pistol, but I think for the most part, I'm just going to be standing him quite straight. So I guess it doesn't bother me too much, but I just feel like that is a little bit of a letdown, especially when I compare him to what we get in the vintage collection nowadays, which is really good articulation. So let's quickly test out his blaster pistol. So it's actually fairly flat. You can kind of see it's quite a flat little blaster pistol accessory there. It is sculpted in a fairly glossy silver kind of gray paint. It's hard to tell if it's metallic silver or just kind of a flat silver. It's got a little bit of sort of a sheen to it. We've got an enclosed trigger guard, sort of an oval there. We've got a nice scope sculpted there. I've got to say, nice detail on this one, even with its sort of flat appearance there. We've got some reasonable detail on it there. And of course, let's just quickly test it in his holster, because this has an interesting sort of shape. I'm not sure how well it's actually going to fit in here. If I can get his cape out of the way, I get the feeling I'm going to have to put the scope on the outside to make it fit. It's not really fitting. It's kind of interesting. It's kind of sitting in there. I don't know if it's supposed to, it doesn't really want to fit the scope in there. So if I put the scope on the outside, it just kind of sits there. It's not really going, I don't know if you can just see the tip of the sort of emitter just there at the bottom. It's not extending below it. I guess that looks okay on his hip. I was just kind of expecting it to kind of fit in there a little bit. The holster itself doesn't actually sort of look like a holster. It just kind of looks like a brown tube sort of sitting there. It's not sort of flat. It's a little bit of sort of just an interesting shape. Perhaps could have been sculpted a little bit better, but I guess I'm going to have to look at the costume references to see if that is sort of true to what it looks like on his costume. So I think for me personally, I think I might be posing the blaster pistol in his hand, because I think that might look cooler. So of course we've got his extended trigger finger. His fingers are a little bit tight on this one. There we go. You can get his finger in there. He grips onto that quite well. It's quite a firm grip there. Because the gun was so, the blaster was so thin, I was worried I was going to sort of flex it a little bit. Sometimes it's easier to put the slightly more rigid accessories in the hands, but he holds that really well. And of course, we've got good articulation at the wrist, so he's going to be able to do some really cool poses. So I think he definitely looks better with that in his hands. And let's just quickly test it in his left hand as well, because we don't often have that opportunity. So yes, the gun is a little bit flexible. It's kind of a thin plastic. Okay, so yep, same deal. Goes into his hand with a little bit of a wriggle, but he holds onto it very well. You can see the grip very nicely aligned to the sculpting of the blaster pistol, and his finger fits in there nicely. Some characters, the blasters kind of sit out to the side to fit in with their fingers. I like it when everything lines up with their wrists. So you can sort of see it looks proper. He's not sort of pointing it off to the side to get that trigger finger in place. Really fun, the fact that I can get his accessory in either hand. That's a little bit unusual when it comes to blaster pistols, so I quite like that. So just going to pop that back in his original hand. This is a little bit of a flexible gun, not too bad, but it does get a little bit tricky popping it in his hand, but once you got it in place, it looks really good. Okay, so there we go. That is the Magistrate Greef Karga figure from season 2. I do think we need lots of different versions of Greef Karga, especially since we know that we're not really going to see him in subsequent Star Wars content like the Mandalorian and Grogu film. It would have been really fun to see him. I hope we do get a version of his sort of high magistrate robes as we see them in episode 3, especially with those droids that sort of carry the train of his magnificent ensemble. Yeah, he's just such a fun character, and it's really sad to know that we're not really going to see any more adventures of Greef Karga. At least he got a really cool sort of story arc, and he really did help turn Navarro around. It was really nice to see the way that he was really loyal and dedicated to improving Navarro in that 3rd season. So I thought that he had a really good character arc there, and I hope we get more merchandise of this character. There were some quibbles with this figure, I have to say. I know it's a little bit older and Hasbro's always trying to improve, But yeah, there was just a few tiny paint flaws and my bothersome hips on this one. Of course, if they do a new figure, I think he would have those sort of improved hip joints. I don't like it when I feel like I might break my figure while I'm simply trying to use the articulation that is built into the figure. Of course, because he has long robes, I'm going to be standing him up, so I don't really need the articulation of the hips, but that is just my perspective. Other fans do some really impressive toy photography with all different poses. Perhaps you've got a custom sort of Navarro cantina or some other set where you want to sit him down and those hips are just going to get in the way. I don't think I could get this figure to sit down. He's going to be standing straight up. So yeah, I really do enjoy finally opening up this figure so that I can add Greef Karga to my Mandalorian figure display, slowly going through and opening up all of my figures to really flesh out the season. And yeah, really great to have Greef Karga in the mix, and just a really special way to sort of honor Carl Weathers and his contribution to his Star Wars character. And of course, he even got to direct a couple of episodes as well, so he will be greatly missed. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today as I opened up another Star Wars vintage collection figure and had fun checking out the details and taking a moment to remember Carl Weathers. I hope you have a wonderful morning, afternoon or evening wherever you are in the galaxy, and let's hang out again very soon for more Star Wars fun. May the Force be with you. If you're a vintage collection fan, I recently opened up the Mandalorian Imperial base figure, VC185. That video is linked here in case you haven't already seen it, as well as a whole vintage collection playlist. This is the way.